You're listening to the Speaking Tongues podcast. I'm your host, El Charisse. Each week, I sit down to a conversation with multilinguals where we discuss and celebrate language, life, and culture through our own perspectives. Episode 55, Speaking Hawaiian. Hello, language lovers. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Speaking Tongues, the podcast in conversation with multilinguals. My guest today is Kainoa, the founder of lelo, a free virtual Hawaiian language school. And frankly, lelo is a whole entire Hawaiian culture experience. It's really, truly a vibe, you guys. In this episode, Kainoa talks to us about growing up in a farming community in Hawaii and how the languages of Spanish and Japanese were often encouraged for kids to learn as a second language. He teaches us about Hawaiian pidgin, its grammar and structure, and tells us why this language is so significant to Hawaiian culture and history. We learn some Hawaiian history and how this history has affected the usage and growth of the Hawaiian language. We also learn about Hawaiian language revitalization efforts, and we compare words and pronunciations across Polynesian languages and cultures. We even learn about the culture and traditions of Hawaiian lei-making and receiving. I ask you to listen to this episode and to pay attention to the choice of words that Kainoa uses to describe the Hawaiian landscape. It indicated to me that it is impossible to talk about Hawaiian language without discussing the richness and abundance of the landscape. Now, before you get to listening, I just want to mention that this is one of our longer episodes, and I purposely kept it this way as there is a lot of information that I wanted you all to hear. I learned so much from Kainoa, and his stories kept me on the edge of my seat. I truly could have talked to him for hours. So before you continue listening, make sure you go settle in, maybe grab a cup of tea, and maybe a pen and paper to take notes as I did when we talked. A big thank you and a true mahalo to Kainoa and lelo for sharing your story and for educating us all on Hawaiian language and culture. If you enjoy this episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Speaking Tongues podcast on Apple Podcasts so that other language lovers like ourselves can find the show. And if you've been a long-time listener of the show or a recent listener, you can now support the show on buymeacoffee.com. Links to all platforms are in the show notes. Okay, let's chat. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Tongues. I'm here today with Kainoa. How are you today, Kainoa?
I'm really well. I'm excited to be part of this and share a little bit about my experiences in Hawaiian language.
I'm so thrilled to talk to you about Hawaiian language today. You have no idea. I'm over the moon. I like to start each episode with the same question, and that is, what is your first language and which languages have you learned to speak?
Growing up, I did not speak Hawaiian. I grew up in a sugarcane plantation community, and
Wow.
for a lot of people who don't know about how the time when a lot of different people immigrated to Hawaii, at one point it was its own nation. And so the the community I grew up in was very multicultural. Already I identify as Hawaiian, Filipino, Portuguese, Japanese, Spanish. And so that I'd say really reflected the community that I was part of.
Mm-hmm.
And growing up in Hawaii, you hear what we call pidgin. It sounds kind of like a broken, slangy kind of English.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe sometimes there are words that belong to the different cultural groups, predominantly the host culture, which is Hawaiian. Whether used grammatically correct or incorrectly, you hear this growing up. So I would say I was raised between English and this kind of Hawaiian pidgin in the local community. And I know that was the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, I guess, which languages have I learned to speak? Um, when I attended high school, I attended a boarding school on another island. And it wasn't until actually, I think it was my freshman year. Of course, there's that elective slash language requirement that you need to satisfy.
Right.
Um, and I think, there's this kind of um, this stigma that if you learn Hawaiian, or there was this stigma that if you learn Hawaiian, you wouldn't get a job. And job security is really important, of course, to
Hmm.
support, your family of your own, and to give back to the family that raised you.
Right.
And, I know in my family, I can't speak for every family in Hawaii, but the idea was, go learn Japanese because you can, go to Japan, you can be successful.
Hmm.
Japanese is a business language. And that was actually the same kind of, you know, advice I got, not only from my family, but family friends, and classmates and other community members that I would interact with, when they'd ask, what do you want to do after you graduate high school, if you graduate high school?
Hmm.
And I said what I said. And they said, well, you should also learn Spanish, because Spanish is another language that will get you, a great paying job. You can move to California and you can find something awesome there. And so growing up, and even in this boarding school as a boarder, living away from home, there was just general talk, general feel of maybe I shouldn't learn Hawaiian, although I
Hmm.
went to a private institution set up by a Hawaiian monarch during the late 1880s, right?
Hmm.
Princess Pauahi. And her intention was that the school was meant for people who could identify as Aboriginal or Hawaiian blooded people, with X amount
Oh.
of, a blood quantum.
Okay.
Um, and so they'd give Hawaiian language in forms of policy, value, classroom management, whatever you want to call it,
Hmm.
fun events and activities. But even though there were Hawaiian language classes, I was always concerned about, oh, like, what am I doing after Hawaii, after I graduate?
Hmm.
So those are a little bit about the first languages I spoke and what languages I learned throughout my life early
Is
on.
it sounds like there was a really big push, I guess, in the community to learn, Japanese, you said, and Spanish. Was there an expectation that maybe kids, or, I guess in your generation when you were growing up, that they would leave Hawaii?
Yeah, I think, and again, at that time, I grew up so I was born in Hilo, for those of you that know about Hilo. It's the more northeast side of the big island of Hawaii, which is also
Hmm.
called Hawaii Island. But I was raised along the Hamakua coast, which is the more green, lush, verdant side of the island compared to Kona, which everyone
Hmm.
associates with being sunny, having the white sandy beaches, and hotels and more tourists.
And coffee.
Beautiful. And coffee, of course. Kona coffee, of course. So, my step family, they were hard workers, are hardworking people, who would connect to this kind of legacy of sugar cane plantationing. And
Hmm.
then my mother's side, my maternal side, they also worked the land, but they were pastoralists. So,
Okay.
we still have about 300 acres of ranch land along,
Ooh.
the lush slopes of Mauna Kea.
Hmm.
But the idea was that if you didn't, if you weren't already working the ranch, or if you weren't, helping out at the farm, or trying to figure out some kind of local business, then you would probably just go to school, and with some education, you probably would move out. You would move away from home,
Hmm.
because that was favorable. You would have job security, and you'd live. in the epicenters of where there was activity on our island, whether Kona, where it was very like tourism driven, or Hilo, which was, very industrial driven, where you're going to work at the airport, where you needed to have the Japanese interpreting kind of skills.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I was at. And I just thought, I really don't know what I want to do. I don't know if I want to stay home and do what everyone's doing
Hmm.
or leave and try something super foreign to me.
Right.
So that's what it was like.
Where did you so you mentioned that you did hear this Hawaiian pidgin spoken, which I think is really fascinating because I didn't say this before, but I visited Hawaii once. And let me just completely stop my train of thought. Should I say Hawaii or Hawaii?
I think you should say what's comfortable in your mouth, because, like the thing about me and the project I'm up to with Hawaiian language is we all are already like a complex makeup of our ancestors.
Mm,
And whether our intention is to do well in acknowledging others by saying others' names, spaces, groups correctly, at the end of the day, physiologically, if we don't have that training and muscular development, our intention is not going to match what our capabilities, you
right.
know, perform. So I'd say what's comfortable. I'm going to stick to Hawaii
Okay.
because that's how I've been trained, learned, developed, and I recognize that, it's there's more than just a bunch of people saying it.
Right.
And so, yeah, I'd say do your best. And if you can
Okay.
do it, do it. If not, you'll always work on it. I trust you.
I will. I will. And I actually I watched the short film you have on your website, and that's when I said, "Oh my god, I've been saying it wrong this whole time." And I never heard anyone say Hawaii before. Even when I was there. So I probably just wasn't paying attention, but that opened my eyes. So I want to thank you for that because, I want to do my best to be respectful, at least to try, like
Yeah, I think that
um
makes a difference. And you just kind of like being explicit about your intentions, I think really works. And that's something I feel like in language work, no matter the language, if we can practice sharing our intention like that,
mhm.
it really helps anyone
Yeah.
involved.
Yeah. So, going back to the question I wanted to ask you, and thank you for that expression and for explaining it. Um, you mentioned this mix of cultures, and hearing the Hawaiian pidgin when you were growing up. How was that expressed? Was it something that everybody spoke? Was it something that was maybe only spoken in certain gatherings, certain situations? Was it something that kids were encouraged to speak?
Yeah, my memory, my childhood memories go to this funny kind of like it was this there was this person, a group of people actually, of comedians, and they would kind of poke fun at the different cultural or even ethnic groups in Hawaii. And overall, there's ways people would identify as being Hawaiian. And it's funny because we call it Hawaii
Hmm.
for those that really know what and how to say it. But then when we say the English word Hawaiian, we don't really add that kind of glottal mark or
Huh.
phenomenon in it and say Hawaiian. Some people do that, but I think it's, I don't know what the English word is, but it's almost like a rally back and forth between the languages, and it's kind of interesting to me. So to this day, I'll still say Hawaii, or the Hawaiian group, the Hawaiian language.
Okay.
But to answer your question, it the comedians, you know, one thing about New York that I love is that you have such a small geography, yet there are so many different types of people. Um, Whether they're forced to live with one another, or choose to live with one another, New Yorkers make it work. And I think that's why I fell in love with why I moved to New York, is because of the people. Um, Through thick and thin, it just works. There's no other choice. You need to make it work. And I
Right.
think that's the parallel of what happens in Hawaii. People from Hawaii can joke about the other cultural group and the ways they look, the ways they do things, and everything. But any other outsider, no matter what they look like or what they say, if you're not from Hawaii, you cannot run those jokes the same way. That was the,
Right.
the feel that these comedians would kind of play about. And so a lot of the skits they do, and this is like late 70s, early 80s, and it's still like a favorite, of the locals in Hawaii, whether they're Hawaiian descent or not. Everybody just remembers that time of like, oh yeah, that's what Filipinos do. Oh yeah, that's what Portuguese people say. Oh
Right.
my gosh, that's what Japanese people, bring to the party all the time. And it kind of amplified what would happen at these sugar plantations, especially, Hawaii being a nation run by the monarchy at that one
Mm.
point,
Mm-hmm.
where they embraced diversity and inclusion of anybody that wanted to immigrate to the nation, but yet everyone spoke Hawaiian at that one point,
Right.
and they spoke their mother language. So you had the Portuguese community speaking Hawaiian to operate in the nation, but then like when they went back home, they'd, talk in whatever dialect or language they would be talking with. And then the Korean community and so forth. And eventually, people fell in love with each other. So you
Mm-hmm.
started to see like these multi-ethnic, cultural, racial, marriages happening in and between the communities. So long story short, these comedians would kind of model almost of what it was like to, and almost stereotype and kind of, in this modeling, like what the general idea, even the stigma was, and kind of desensitize, or make it a little bit more palatable, being like, this actually does happen, and it doesn't mean it's a bad thing all the time. And so, some words that maybe people not from Hawaii would hear if they go to a grocery store, or a park, and they hear somebody calling them like out, instead of saying hey brother, the pidgin word for that would maybe be hey brada, oh brada, how you cuz, like
Mm.
hey brother, how are you cousin. So
Mm-hmm.
there's like familial terms, that sound English, like a broken version of English, but there's an underlying current that if a Hawaiian language learner continues their journey down the rabbit hole of Hawaiian language learning, they're gonna find, um, tiers of addressing others,
Okay.
such as like a family member, or a sibling or a cousin. And so it's very interesting how the host language kind of is like rainwater, and generations later, it's showing up, it's surfacing in its purest form, no matter if they're if the person is a Hawaiian language learner,
Mm-hmm.
speaker, or educator. They're talking about Hawaiian language. So, that's one example, the addressing. Um, but if you give me something in English, maybe a sentence, I'll try and I guess pigeonize it. Is that if that's a word?
A sentence. How about I like your shoes?
Yeah. So, oh, that's a good one. So, I like your shoes. Like how I would say it. It's funny when I go home, I actually jump back into my pigeon wagon, and I'm just like, oh yeah,
That's
nice,
amazing.
nice are your shoes, nice are your shoes. So it's funny because when in English we'd say your shoes are nice, but then in Hawaiian, and in the elements of Hawaiian grammar, but even in this Hawaiian pigeon, we start with nice.
Hmm.
Nice are your shoes, and the intonation lands down as if the the volume, pitch, cadence, and speed of the voice is actually like eyeballs. It's like, take a look, it's down there. Nice are your shoes.
Huh. How interesting.
Yeah. So I know a lot of Hollywood movies, sometimes they'll have that Hawaiian pigeon speaking character, forget
Mm-hmm.
that movie, but I know it was with Adam Sandler, and I think Adam Sandler, and he always
Oh.
has that one character, in all of his movies. But one, it was the guy with the ponytail, and he was like, the local Hawaiian uncle, brother kind of person, and I was listening to his attempt at pidgin, and it was cute, but it was like
Mm-hmm.
there's things that need a little bit tweaking to make it very authentic. And
Yeah.
I think growing up in this kind of community, it really was that kind of multi community living where certain aspects of pidgin sounded, a little bit Filipino or
Mm-hmm.
Portuguese or Chinese. But at the end of the day, there was that underlying, even grammatical current of it kind of aligns with Hawaiian grammar,
Mm.
and I don't really
Okay.
want to be strict and say Hawaiian grammar, but Hawaiian language feel.
Yeah. I love that you're breaking this down because I think that it's really easy to look at pigeons and creoles and just think that it's a corroded form of whatever language standard happens to be spoken by other people in that country or in that region.
Hmm.
But I think, I just I think it's really interesting that you're explaining how it has a relationship to Hawaiian, but it also, it has elements of its own and it has a structure. So that's really that's really fascinating. We got to do a second episode about Hawaiian
I'm
pigeon.
telling you, but you touch on a really good point, because at that point where I was trying to figure out my life along with my classmates and everyone else my age, we were told that if you go into public and you're talking pigeon, you were thought of as uneducated. And
Mhm.
so you need to come correct, speak proper English, which we were just still trying to figure out,
Right.
and I think that has shifted. A lot of the authors and colleagues of mine who are leading this new, um, this refreshing, I guess, movement of Hawaiian language revitalization, they're using this Hawaiian pidgin as a stepping stone,
Mhm.
especially for those back at home in Hawaii, to understand, oh, I've been using this grammatical structure in pidgin, English, Hawaiian all my life,
Mhm.
and this is helping me actually reclaim my mother tongue,
Right.
so it's really exciting.
I know that and I hope that anyone listening to this realizes like the Hawaiian language is being revitalized. But I want to ask you, I guess, when you were growing up and when you were living in Hawaii, um, where did you see representations of the Hawaiian language? Did you know anybody who spoke it? Was it in the names of places, or was it in the maybe some of the traditional things that people did, or anything? Where would you see this language
Yeah,
iterated?
I that's a great question. It really starts with the people. You such a big practice to this day, and an ancient practice which people, they don't realize how serious and almost prophetic it is, but naming people. So one local practice is like everyone needs a Hawaiian language, a Hawaiian middle name. You know,
Oh,
of course, especially if you're Hawaiian.
right.
Um, and so three ways that I remember I was taught that people are named is it's either by a person that comes and visits an ancestor or the mother expecting in their dream or in
Mhm.
spirit form. Like when you, like, one example, this lady, she reached out to me and she's like, I want to name my child this. And I said, well, just be looking for signs. Sure enough, a few nights before she contacted me again, she's like, I felt something sit on my bed. I woke up and it was my grand aunt, and she was wearing a certain flower which I see all in her photos, and I'm like, did she say anything to you? She's like, no, it's just like a movie, like I could see her, but I couldn't see her. I didn't know if it was real. And I just started sweating and I was freaking out. I was scared, but I wasn't. And I'm like, yeah, 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 got it. So I was like, do you know what that flower is? Sure enough, she goes outside and she didn't know that flower grew in her backyard. and it was like in bloom, like just
Stop it.
profusely in bloom. Yeah. So there's that. There's
Oh,
these
that's
like
amazing.
dream kind of avenues. Then
Mm-hmm.
there's any kind of event or kind of like geographical situation that's happening in the vicinity of the birth,
Mm-hmm.
or there's a renaming. For example, if I mentioned to her, if her great grandmother had a name and she's dreaming of her grandmother, or she's smelling her grandmother when she's giving birth, like that's how I learned that people would give names. Now it's just like, oh, I'm going to go online to the Hawaiian language dictionary and I'm just going to look for something cute because I like the ocean and
Mm-hmm.
I feel calm. And so that is kind of like the double-edged kind of like danger almost,
Yeah.
letting too much people into a practice, a trained practice, like
Mm-hmm.
a specialist would have to almost give the name within the family,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
like a local person, or you just wait for it. Sometimes kids wouldn't get a name way after they were born, but now in most hospitals you can't leave until the name is on the birth certificate.
Right. Right.
So it's like, so that's one. It's in the person, and the second one is in the food. Going to local places, you see, instead of like tuna, you see ahi.
Mm-hmm.
And you never think like, oh, is that a Japanese? So you grow up thinking, is that a Filipino word, Japanese word? Like, what kind of word is that? Ahi. And especially now it's such a globalized word like ahi, but
Right.
without the okina in the front. It's like, oh, I thought that was a species of tuna. It's like, no, that's the Hawaiian word for tuna.
Oh my God. I didn't know
you
that.
know yeah. And I'm kind of like mind blown when a lot of friends and colleagues say that. I'm like, it's okay, like it doesn't come with a little disclaimer saying like this comes from a ancient Hawaiian proverb that says ka'ahi kanana ke ahi kanana o kamoana, meaning like the strong tuna of the deep ocean, comparing it to the strongest warrior of an army. Because
Wow.
when you have to fish that tuna, it's like it gives up. You could be fighting it for 4 hours trying to
Yeah.
get it out of the ocean. So yeah, that's it. It's the people, it's the food, and then it's the place.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up, I grew up next to what they call the Valley of the Kings, or Waipio Valley, and that's where one of the many areas the ancient kings and queens would kind of, or chiefs and chiefesses would frequent. And we have old land divisions that carry their names. For example, my family's ranch land is along the slopes of Mauna Kea, but the land division is called Nie Nie. And growing up, like, you see all of these Hawaiian names
Mm-hmm.
and you hear Hawaiian music growing up, but you never really notice it like
Right.
intently. You're just like, oh, that sounds good, sounds cute. Oh, wow, that's a hard place name to say. So, like, even my family would say shortened versions of it, or
Mm-hmm.
they would name it like, the water tube. Like, oh, we're going down to the water tube today, when it was something like, Nie Nie Gulch or Nie Nie Valley.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and what's kind of crazy is that a lot of the street names in Hawaii carry these older names of the land divisions before this huge event called the Great Mahele. But now you start to see new land divisions, especially residential areas, where someone from outside of Hawaii will purchase this huge quadrant of land and start developing homes. And because they see Hawaiian names, they're thinking, oh, I can name it with cute flower names,
Oh.
like the Hawaiian word for hibiscus, or these sweet smelling flowers, and it has no relation to the land.
Mm-hmm.
So as when people go to barren volcanic rock home developments and they see the word like Plumeria Street, but Melia Street, they're expecting to see like a grove of sweet smelling Melia flowers.
Mm-hmm.
But when they get there, they're like smelling sulfur, and they're
Oh.
just kind of like, oh, that's interesting. That was on one personal account of a friend of a friend shared with me. I was like, yeah, like this is what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
The names had, they were a small description. They were a code with sensitive and private information for the area, the people, the food, the systems. And
Mm-hmm.
now a lot of these new names have no relation at all to what's actually happening in that area. So people, food, and places is what I really grew up on noticing. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
they brought in a lot of the elders, Hawaiian culturalists,
Yeah.
who would come in and sing color songs with us and share Hawaiian values. But that was pretty much the extent when I was much younger growing up in
Okay.
Hawaii.
I just want to say Hawaii sounds so majestic right now in everything you're describing. And I'm so like, oh, it's
Yeah.
just like, it's like there's so much to like. I always say this, because I went to Hawaii and it's not about me, but I'll just tell you this real quick. I went to Hawaii almost 10 years ago and I think about it every day. I was just in Honolulu, but I think about it every single day. And I think about how, like, I had this privilege to go see this beautiful, beautiful island because I was only on one island. And I know there's so much that I didn't even get to see and I didn't even get to experience. And then it made me think about the people who visit Hawaii and how I guess I relate it to like the Caribbean because you can go there and you stay on the resort, right? Or you stay on like Waikiki and
Hmm.
you don't there's no forced interaction with and I'm saying forced because it's like it's very easy to separate yourself from being a tourist from seeing what all the Hawaiians are doing. And I really felt that unfortunately and I did get a chance to go to like other places on the island and I just remember thinking like I want to be here. Like this is like the real, part of the island where people are living and, you know, um going about their lives and working and there's so much more beyond like just sitting on Waikiki and doing nothing and just relaxing. Um I'm saying all this to say like I know that this culture is so it has so much historical value and I just hope that people can see that, especially if they ever visit. But I hope that people are able to see the value of Hawaiian culture and language beyond that, beyond the tourism, spectrum. Was there any specific instance that led you to the decision to want to learn and ultimately teach the Hawaiian language?
Yeah, I actually did take a Hawaiian language course in high school, but it didn't even last beyond a quarter. I just needed to satisfy the elective. And the teacher that accepted me, at last minute because I was late for registration, she was so nice. She's like, okay, I get it. You're not really wanting anything to do with Hawaiian. Just kind of come in and do what you got to do and, end the court and the whatever, how long you're here. I was like, got it. Um, but it wasn't until I wanted to go to California. I was hoping that my grades were good enough, but apparently they weren't. I was on AP, not the good AP, not on advanced placement. I was on academic
Academic
probation.
probation. Oh
Right.
gosh.
Like at least 2 quarters a year. And I'm thinking, like so delusional. I'm like, I'm such a good student. I get turning my work. I'm like, no, no. And this school I went to, the Kamehameha schools, was named after, Princess Pauahi's, Ohana, her ancestor. And
Mhm.
so the idea is that we are there to prep to go to awesome colleges. It was a preparatory academy. It is a preparatory, a very prestigious private school. And I was like, no, like the other 300 plus classmates of mine are excelling and I'm like not. So
Mm,
I was like, you know what are my interests? At that time, I did like a mini docu-series on Kaho'olawe, one of the islands.
mm,
Fortunately, that was the island that was used as a test bomb target by the Navy. And I grew an interest to learn video production. So I wanted to go to Chapman University. I
mhm.
got denied.
Oh.
And at that time, my mom, she was going through personal, choices, and a
Mhm.
divorce happened. And I was like, okay, got it. So money's a little tight, grades not looking good, future's not looking so bright. So I ended up back at home on my island, and we
Mm-hmm.
have a satellite location of the University of Hawaii. There's
Mm.
one on Oahu in Manoa and one in Hilo on the Big Island. And it's funny. It's like, okay, back at home, not really where I want to be. I was young. I'm like, I want to be out and doing different things.
Right.
And I quickly was like looking for the easiest major to declare. I'm like, is it communications? Is it psychology, political science? What is it? Just give it to me. I just want to get done with this, get the good grades. And I met this, I went to a garage party in Hilo, just in Hawaii. Most parties happen in the garage, and different family and friends come over, and they'll bring like little hors d'oeuvres or poke, because
Mm-hmm.
everybody eats poke now.
Yeah, it's the thing.
It's the thing. And beer and whatever else. And it's just like a night of laughing, teasing, crying, sometimes fighting. I mean, the most any family in a garage would do, as a pastime. And I met this who I didn't know was a professor or a lecturer at the university.
Mm-hmm.
And she was a short, cute, quaint little Filipino lady, short hair, rosy cheeks. And she comes over and she's talking in Hawaiian. I'm like, I have no idea what you're saying to me, and you're freaking me out. I'm like, okay. And so my friends at that time, they were like, oh, this is her. She teaches this class. You should enroll. And she's like, you will enroll in my class. I said, yeah, I will. Got it. So that was the start of an awesome relationship. I enrolled, and her name is Haunani Bernardino. And I took her first year accelerated course. I loved it. And it really, when people say it's not what it is, or the event or anything, but it's the people that really make the difference.
Right.
Yeah, she really was like a third mother to me. It was like mind blowing. And I think it's something indigenous. I think it's something super Hawaiian that she embodied, even though she didn't identify as a native Hawaiian. I think
Mm-hmm.
she identified as a Filipino woman,
Right.
but she had mastered Hawaiian in such a way that she had a reputation that whoever she taught, she expected of them to have this high standard of holding the language, because it represented a legacy of this whole humanity, of these
Mm-hmm.
humans that lived and thrived in Hawaii. So she
Yeah.
took it very serious. But it was the turning point for me was when she told me she had cancer. And in the following semester she had passed.
Oh,
And her
I'm so
family asked
sorry.
me, yeah, I know. It was like, like your kung fu master is like just breaking you down. And then all of a sudden, like right when compassion comes up back from in your throat to say thank you and appreciate you and I love you and I see you and everything, she's like on her way out. And
Mm.
it was like, so her family had asked me to receive leis. They had her cremated, but it was at the point where I was like seeing so many people come through the church with leis and these famous musicians and like just everybody and anybody that you knew in Hawaii in and around Hawaiian language and culture work was like there. And I remember kind of like hiccuping or coughing, and this was like an hour deep into receiving leis, because the idea was that people would come in, and this is something the family had set up. It's not something traditional Hawaiian or whatever. It could be, but not to my knowledge. But her urn was to my left, and I was receiving the leis, and I had to put the leis on this massive tree. And it was like an almost an hour in, and I was like, whoa. And I kind of coughed, and I just kind of like coughed up tears, and I couldn't stop crying.
Oh.
And I still remember it like it was yesterday, smelling the flowers, seeing her urn, being in disbelief, and then really asking myself, they had that little dinner gathering after, and it was fun. It celebrated her. But I was like sitting alone and thinking like, what the heck am I gonna do with my life?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so when I went back to Hilo, because she's originally from Palolo on Oahu, the island you visited. So I
Mm-hmm.
went back to Hilo, and I remember I think it was a couple of days after, I went to her empty office, and her family, they were supposed to come and collect her belongings, but I went to her office, and weirdly enough, usually the department locks everyone's doors. I mean, it's a university. It was unlocked.
Huh.
And all my off period times I would spend in her office and just nag on her and bother her. So I went in and I just sat on the recliner and like I just broke down. And what's weird is a department head next door, he came in and he's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." He consoled me, everything. And I'm like, "I can't believe this. Like, I really can't." And like, I'm gonna declare my major today as Hawaiian Studies. And I went
Mm.
down to the office and I declared my major as Hawaiian Language Studies. And from there, I promised I would never be on academic probation. And it was true. I just made it work. I was on the dean's list, and I just went through their bachelor's program. I entered the Indigenous teacher education program. I completed the master's in Indigenous language and education program for myself, but with her at my side, like
Mm-hmm.
her rigor and strictness about my
Wow.
my participation. So yeah, there, all of that.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that story. That's very powerful.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, in case anyone else is wondering what I'm wondering, when you say receiving the lays, what is that?
In Hawaii, there's different ways people want to celebrate and honor life. Sometimes, like one of my uncles, he had passed, and his son and a lot of actually the family closer to that family, they would sail on canoes because there's this huge revitalization project to bring back ancient Hawaiian navigation and canoe sailing. So they would break up flower petals, sail out, and then they would scatter the flower petals and sing songs on the water and
Mhm.
whatever. I think the family chose for Kumuhaunani to they invited everyone, bring your favorite flower or a favorite flower of hers and make it into a lei. We're going to have this tree, this barren
Okay.
tree, and we're going to have Kainoa. And my classmate at that time, Ahia, she helped me, and we're going to place it on this tree as a way to bring life and celebration back. And it was like a backdrop to her urn throughout the
Mhm.
service. So as people were sitting there, they could feel like they were part of her life. So you look at this tree, it's like a massive tree of different flowers, and it's like, whoa, imagine, like what that would mean,
Mhm.
and the lei is such an important, magic. It's almost like magic. It's people don't realize that, you can pick a flower and there's certain processes, like you need to chant and request of the forest of what you need, and then as you're doing it you need to only think of good thoughts, and you're making all your tools, all your energy. You never step over a lei, you never eat or do sloppy or negative things around lei making. When
Mhm.
you give it, you give it with intention. You could make a bad lei and give it to someone and they could get sick, you
Right.
know
Right.
um so the flowers and the leaves that I recall people made, it was just like, the peak of love and
Mm.
blessing and remembrance. Whether it was sweet scented maile or, like potent heady, jasmine pikake flower lays. It was just like, whoa. And here
Wow.
I am, person with allergies and allergic to fragrant flowers. I didn't sneeze once that night, and I'm like, okay, great. It worked. It worked out. I didn't have to take Claritin or anything else. So yeah,
Wow.
it was just a
That's
practice that they came up with.
that's really beautiful.
Hmm.
So, Hawaiian language revitalization. Tell us what that entails. Tell us what you know about the efforts to ensure that next generations of Hawaiians have access to the language and to the culture and the land that's tied to this language and culture.
Okay, I had to kind of review all of my notes and everything to kind of like really have us time travel, but do it within like less than 5 minutes.
Okay.
So bear with me, everybody, as we kind of like shift the conversation into like we're going back to the future almost. So I think the first significant date was 1814 when Henry Opukaha'ia, a Hawaiian a young Hawaiian man had traveled from Hawaii all the way out to New England, and he was studying to be a Christian missionary. He already was translating the Bible and coming up with ways to shift the English grammar such that people back at home in Hawaii could palate it and really be like, oh, okay, my tongue is doing Hawaiian sounds. I don't know what these foreign symbols and sounds are, but like I'll try, like Zion, like how do you say that? There's
Right.
no
Yeah.
the sound. So he was out all the way in New England, but apparently he died, and everything that he was doing, and he was out in Connecticut. He died, and all of his notes got lost. And the reason why I bring that up is because even after that, King Liholiho, or Kamehameha, what is that, the second? Oh gosh. If you're listening to this and I'm getting it wrong, I apologize. A bit rusty on monarchy history, but I believe it was King Liholiho. He had actually sent out more young Hawaiians into the country districts where, you know, these elders and families really held some serious like literature knowledge. Like not literature, because Hawaiian wasn't all oral language.
Right.
So, and a lot of these communities, they didn't know how to read and write. So there was the king at that time was like, okay, we need to send people who can read and write to start journaling, recording, note taking every single piece of ancestral knowledge out there, so we can
Hmm.
start our own little database, and then kind of translate, as needed. Um, and then again, with this idea and this push to come up with some kind of syllabary, or these syllables that would break down language where people can palate and learn it and then replicate that learning with others. So I wanted to just bring up those two names because most times when people talk about Hawaiian language revitalization, they credit the missionaries for developing a reading and writing system and innovating and almost kind of saving, you know, Hawaiian language, when it really was by individual choice, by, like leadership that was of Native Hawaiian representation. And I just wanted to kind of just put that here,
Right.
stake
Right.
that in the ground,
Yeah.
and then acknowledge, I think it was around eight. So I believe the missionaries, they were already going through Polynesia, and they were developing writing systems with the Maori people in Aotearoa, or New Zealand, and even in Tahiti, and like the Marquesas. And so they kind of had a model of like their treatment of language. Like, how do we, get our mission going, but then have the local language kind of like fuse with it and get our teachings out in their language. So that was kind of already out there. Then they go to Hawaii, then they're starting to replicate some of their methodologies, and they're like, okay, like, how do we do this? So I think it was around 1826, I believe, the missionaries actually start standardizing a Hawaiian alphabet, um, to almost like, I guess, present some kind of form, right? So we're
Mm-hmm.
looking at prescriptive stuff now, where they're like, this is what it looks like on paper, this is what it should sound like. And there was some kind of mix up, I think, because they were using like Latin symbols,
Hmm.
and here, and what I guess we hear mostly today in wherever we're at, I think for most of us listeners, is like almost a standardized American English. Back then it was, I think I would assume, don't quote me on this, but it would sound a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then you have this school set up in 1830 that, again, it was a teacher training college for people to go out, start collecting and start writing and teaching other Hawaiians how to write, how to read, where you had subjects like trigonometry, anatomy, world geography, political science, like Greek,
Wow.
Hebrew, like those things being taught,
Mm-hmm.
um, in English, but mostly through Hawaiian.
Right.
So fast forward, you have a bunch of people coming through Hawaii. They're becoming these editors, these publishers of Hawaiian language newspapers. And really, this school on Maui, they started in 1834. That was the catalyst of, like, really what is now today one of the largest indigenous canons, or just vaults, repositories of an indigenous language captured in newspaper form.
Oh,
You
wow.
know, next to our cousins in Aotearoa, the
Mm-hmm.
Maori, they have their own newspaper. But if you look in these newspapers, you have ancient stories and practices, and then you have like Cinderella or Snow White, which they call in one instance Haunani. You know, it's like funny knowing Haunani, then finding Snow White in 7 different iterations, and it's like whoa, you know. And
Wow.
you see them translate even William Shakespeare. They gave his name in Hawaiian thought and transliteration. So they made his name sound like Hawaiian. So William was Williama, and then they actually gave him a Hawaiian thought, you know, to his last name. So shake a spear. So to shake something multiple times back and forth is ho'onauewe.
Hmm.
And then a spear is ihe. So he was known in the newspapers as Williama ho'onauewe ihe.
Wow.
You know, and then you had world history, and the queen at, you know, at one point was going to Great Britain to celebrate Queen Victoria's, her queen's jubilee.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, King Kalakaua was inviting people from around the world to cook these French delicious cuisines at the palace. And then electricity happened. So a lot was happening, I guess is what I'm saying. And then
Yeah.
fast forward to, of course, the illegal occupation, where, you know, like the small group of American businessmen were like, okay, so we are the descendants of missionaries, and we see profit in really occupying
Oh,
the space
man.
of Hawaii. And that really shifted everything. It went from like multi everything,
Mm-hmm.
super thriving nation, small and powerful with strong allies. I think they were in the yacht club of, you know, this international society of nations,
Mm-hmm.
recognized by like Portugal, Spain, you know, Great Britain. And this is, Hawaii was already a nation way before America had gotten its bearings as a
Yeah.
nation.
Yeah.
And, you know, because of that illegal occupation and the imprisonment of the queen, you start to see kind of like dissonance in the community, like, ooh, like I don't, maybe we shouldn't. And then they started to ban the hula. I think a significant date is 1896. This is where there was an education policy that said all instruction should be in only the medium of English. So it's kind of like, you know, a way of saying, if we catch you using Hawaiian in your offices, in instruction in the classrooms, on the playgrounds, whatever, there's
Mm-hmm.
going to be something that's going to happen. And sure enough, you hear a lot of these elders talking about like, you know, we were hit with yardsticks. We had to go hold up rocks in the backyard.
Oh,
They
my
made us
God.
walk barefoot on hot, you know, like objects. And then teachers were getting fired. There were death threats, you know, like put in front of homes, or people would throw rocks at windows. It was just like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, whether people would argue and say, oh, that's just hearsay, or whether you actually have these like great grandchildren of these people, you know,
Yeah.
living and doing documentaries saying, like, yeah, we have proof. It's just crazy to think like that was a big part of what Hawaiian language revitalization is today.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Was that a
So
lot already?
you said 1896.
The educational policy? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So at what point from 1896 until the present, like when did that punitive behavior begin to subside?
I think that's a great question. And I think that's, you know, what we talked about with the pidgin, you know, like, oh, if you speak pidgin, even if you speak like a broken Hawaiian, you don't know how to talk English. Like, who are you? Like, go back in the valley, you know, like,
Right.
you're one of those like radicals, those activists who don't want things to be developed. You're not part of this new age, new world, you know, that is embracing tourism and belonging to the world. And I think that had like a really negative impact on the well-being of the locals, but especially of the native Hawaiian people. And so you've seen like obesity skyrocket and
Mm.
high blood pressure. And then there was a push for Hawaiian health before Hawaiian language, of course.
Wow.
So fast forward, I think it was like the late 1980s. You have my teachers, and Kumu Haunani, she was part of this. She was a student actually of these pioneers. A group of parents, they met with the last remaining native Hawaiian elders speakers in Kauai. And there's an exclusive community that was, I think, bought out by the Robinson family, I believe. They bought Ni'ihau, or part of Ni'ihau, which is the most northern Hawaiian island, major Hawaiian island.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really was the families there grew up in almost isolation. They weren't really frequenting, and outsiders weren't frequenting into the Ni'ihau location. But between Ni'ihau and Kauai, the families would kind of get together. So anyway, it's thought of that the dialect there and the Hawaiian language spoken there is possibly the truest form of Hawaiian, even to this day.
Okay.
But in the late 80s, maybe even early 80s, a group of parents who were concerned about Hawaiian language because all the elders are dying. There's no book, there's nothing. They were like, okay, I want my child to learn Hawaiian. And I'm struggling learning, speaking it, but like what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
Long story short, they incorporate a not-for-profit in Hawaii called the Ahapunana Leo, and their mission really was at that time, and still is, to drive and inspire Hawaiian language medium education through preschools. And they worked closely with allies in Aotearoa. So a lot of the leaders in Maori language revitalization created these language nests where children, preschoolers basically of that age, they would be immersed by elders and student teachers in Hawaiian and eventually pick it up. And from there, it stemmed from what we call the P20 program. Mm-hmm. So from preschool, then the kindergarten, first grade, all the way to 12th grade, now an undergraduate program, teacher education program, master's, and now most recently a PhD.
Wow.
All via Hawaiian language.
That is so exciting.
I know. It's such a great, comeback.
Yeah. That's incredible. I would love to know some things about the language. If you can, tell me about how the language is structured. Tell me, are there cases? Is it a gendered language? I know you mentioned a glottal stop before in the name Hawaii. Are there any special pronunciations or anything that you can demonstrate?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when we think of languages, we don't realize that there could possibly be some familial connection with other languages. We maybe see that with the Romantic languages, but we never think about it in any other. So maybe let's do a fun activity. I wrote some words down between different places, different groups of languages. So from maybe left to right, visually I'm looking at it for those of you listening, because it just helps me. I can't really memorize things from other languages, but let's try the word for sky. Okay, so from the first one is going to be Tongan, second one is going to be Samoan, then Rapa Nui, then Tahitian, then Maori, Marquesian, and then the last one's going to be Hawaiian. And this exercise is just to hear and kind of experience this almost familial, almost variation relationship between these places within, and around the Polynesian triangle.
Okay.
So I'm going to say the word. Actually, let me say all of it. And then I'll say one by one, and then have you all try and repeat after me. Does that work for everyone? Does that work for you?
That works for me. I'm going to repeat after you, whether you like it or not.
Okay, so let me just say it all at once so you can just hear the variations, and then we'll jump in together. So this is the word or one of the words, because culturally there's just so much other words or parts of the word, parts of the sky words. So sky is langi, langi, rangi, rai, rangi, ani, lani. Okay. So you ready? Let's just try for Tongan. Langi.
Langi.
Okay. Samoan is it's pretty much the same, and I might be looking over some intonation and breathing, but it's the same to me. Langi.
Langi.
And then Rapa Nui, it starts with an R, but you're gonna roll it a little bit. Rangi.
Rangi.
And then Tahitian starts with an R, but you're gonna kind of roll it like almost like a D. Rai.
Rai.
Yeah, great. There's that kind of glottal on the I, rai.
Rai. And this was Tahitian?
Yeah, just like how we hear Ra'iatea, like the wide open sky, that's Ra'iatea Tahiti, right? Ra'iatea.
Ra'iatea. Okay.
Yeah, and then Maori is Rangi,
Rangi.
almost similar to the Rapa Nui. And
Mm-hmm.
then Marquesian, it's very interesting. It's the most different, I think, is Ani.
Ani.
And then Hawaiian, it starts with an L, Lani.
Lani.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
hmm Even, and just, I mean, you don't have to do this one, but even in the names of winds, because we, in the islands, we name everything, the
Mm-hmm.
different forms of rain and clouds and sunshines and sensations of the wind and everything, the different parts of a wave. It just
Mm-hmm.
matters. So, like the north wind across these language groups, it would be tokelau, toelau, tokerau, toerau, tokerau, tokoau, ko'olau, right?
Huh.
So, yeah, pretty cool.
That is really cool.
And for those of you who belong to these language groups, I'm just gonna take accountability and apologize if I'm like hammering it in the wrong way. Reach out to me and we'll make it right.
We'll get it sorted. But I
Right.
think I think it's great that you were able to, you're able to see those connections across this Polynesian nations. And what I think is, well, this is, again, it's not about me, but it's another personal thing that I noticed. When I visited Hawaii, I that's when I learned about the different Polynesian nations, and I never even connected them in my head until a friend of mine said, "Oh, you can tell that this particular thing we were looking at was Tahitian, or this one was Tongan, let's say." And it goes back to, I guess, what I was saying before about like the difference between being a tourist on the islands and actually interacting with the culture and the people who live and have their history and work and raise their families on the islands. And I think that that's so important. So
hmm
that's a really a great connection to make. And I'm also going to take accountability for for anything I may have mispronounced, but I'm so glad to practice and to try. And I think to be able to hear that is I think that's really special. Are there dialects of Hawaiian? Maybe either between academic and spoken Hawaiian, or among the islands?
Right. That is the heat of the moment right now. I mean, that's you are talking about live, like right now happening, like trending research. So
Wow.
like there's talk that the Ni'ihau dialect, because I mean, I'll try and imitate, but if I say, um, I don't know, there's more T's, there's more like that rolling R D sound. So if I said Kela, meaning that thing, Kelamea, like that thing over there, far
Mm-hmm.
from us. Maybe a Nihao person would say Teramea. It
Mm.
almost sounds Tahitian to me.
Mm-hmm.
Tera, Kelamea, Teramea. And instead of a kind of like a on the tip of your tongue, like this is an exercise I do, like I say, try and say this tea time for two, and put it on the edge of your tongue. Tea time for two. The Hawaiian tea it's more it's buffered a little bit. Pull back from the edge of your tongue and make it more of a DT sound. So instead of saying tea time for two, try and do something more like tea time for two.
Tea time for two.
Yeah, so instead of telamea or teramea, it would be teramea.
Teramea.
Yeah, and that's kind of like what I hear and experience with some of the Ni'ihau dialect speakers.
Hmm.
Um, and there is the kind of academic, standardized sounds where it's more K, less R rolls on the L.
Mm-hmm.
But these are the things that's exciting in the revitalization, because are you gonna be a prescriptivist of what the institutions are teaching, or are you
Yeah.
gonna be a private investigator and get on the ground with all of us and do the work, and not to discount the great work of these awesome institutions, because they do this work as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think collectively, as in all of the Hawaiian language work, um, when we all come together at these summits and conferences and now Zoom meetings, it is fabulous. It's
Yeah,
like
I bet.
we will debate, we will agree, we will challenge each other's sources, and then at the end of the day, it's like, okay, let's go to Starbucks or go to get some coffee. I don't know, somewhere else than Starbucks.
Yeah.
It's great.
I'm always curious about that because I think that there are things within communities and like regional areas where maybe an outsider may not know the difference, but someone
Mhm.
who's maybe, grown up in a place their whole life, like me, for example, I grew up in New York City. I still live here. I can guess probably within 95% accuracy what borough a person is from based on their accent.
Wow, that's
And
amazing.
a lot of people don't believe me. And I'm not flawless. I'm not Wonder Woman, but but there have been moments where I'm listening to someone and I'm like, I know you're from the Bronx. I can tell you sound like you're from Queens. And then people say like, how do you know? And I can't explain it, but it's just something that my ear is trained to. So I'm always
Oh yeah.
curious about like that kind of those little, I guess, micro regional affectations that we all
Mm.
have being from someplace.
I mean, and there's word variations too. Like
Oh
one
yeah.
word that you sharing that just came up, but then that's the question: is it really a dialect, or is it these almost vocables?
Mm,
Is it a restriction of physical capacity of a person, or is it intentional choice? Is
mm-hmm,
it to distinguish that you belong? Each island was a different government at one time, or is it to hint that it's a new innovation to the language? Like pola used to be the loincloth flap the front flap of a male, the
mm-hmm.
pola. So ka pola, but ke pola is a bowl of cereal. It's like the bowl
Oh
a plastic bowl you eat anything out of, or just a regular bowl. But I
yeah.
think of the roof, like on the Big Island, especially on one of the districts in Puna, they call like anything of the roof or top region like kaupaku,
Hmm.
but then anywhere else you would call it kaupoku. So kaupaku versus kaupoku.
Kapoku. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the culture for a minute. Um More than a minute, but I
I got you.
I could talk about this like for the rest of the day, but I want to talk about the culture for a second, and what I'm enjoying about this conversation so far is just knowing how tied to the culture and the land that the language is. And I love that what I'm getting is that they're inextricable, and they go together, and I think that that's really really important. I think that Hawaii, excuse me.
You got this.
I think
You're doing
I
great.
know I'm gonna go back and edit this and like, damn it. I think that for a lot of people who haven't visited Hawaii or spent time with a Hawaiian person, I think there are a lot of preconceived ideas about the culture. Either that, or many people have a reductive view of Hawaii, and you know what I'm talking about: leis, hula skirts, surfing, pineapples, coffee. Um, Please tell us. What are some things that you'd like for people to know about Hawaiian culture? And what are some things, maybe something I didn't mention, maybe some things that you think people have the wrong idea about or may not be aware of at all?
I think the first, you know, thing to do is I understand how we all perceive culture, because some of us will think it's holidays and events. Some of us would say it's attire, regalia, garb, whatever our words are. Maybe it's the skin color that we see. It's the fragrances and flavors that come from a kitchen. So the first, I guess, to rally it back is, like, how are we all thinking of culture? And I guess I learn best when I use analogy. So for me, I think growing up, with my pastoral family, my cowboy family, and it's so funny, right? Hawaiian cowboy, really? Um, it's I grew up on beef stew, and like, yeah, I moved to New York City to leave my university job to go to, the French Culinary Institute, learn how to scramble some eggs, whatever. And I can cook a better beef stew, but for some odd reason I like the underseasoned, like rushed beef stew, chewy beef
Mm,
bits that I grew up on, because it triggers something like physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually for me.
right.
So I think about culture is like, if like, first, why would, I always ask myself when people approach my online Hawaiian language school, and there's a request process, because in Hawaiian culture an important thing is you have to ask permission. Even if you want to pick a mango from your neighbor's yard, you don't just go and pick it, even if
Hmm.
it's hanging over the fence in your yard. You go
Yeah.
over and say, "Hey, auntie, I saw a mango, I'm hungry for a mango, may I please, have that mango?" She says, "Yes." Great. She says, "No, don't do it."
Hmm.
And a lot of people, they look at culture as if it's like low hanging fruit in nobody's yard, right?
Yes,
When people don't
exactly.
realize, like, that could be like a very integral component to the next healing for someone, right? That mango could be used in some process of healing.
Hmm.
And so I guess what I'm saying is, like, if you have no business in the culture, you don't have to understand it, and it's totally fine.
Hmm.
And if you want business in that culture, the first place to look is your island and your genealogy.
Mm,
Because if you don't come right to the Hawaiian culture, I'll say it in this way: the questions really point at the gaps and missings in your island and your genealogy.
hmm.
And now there's a wide question about, but where are you really from, right?
Right.
Everyone who lived in Hawaii can answer that, whether they're from Portugal, Madeira, Portugal, or from Waipio Valley. They can say, "I actually live under that tree over there. You see the one that's getting smashed by the waterfall? Like, that's where I live." Or, where the prototype of the ukulele came from, in Braga, in Portugal? That's where I'm from.
Hmm.
Like, everyone had a story. And I think that's the thing about a beef stew. That's like culture. When people ask about culture and aspects of the culture, what you're really asking the chef to do is, like, deconstruct the beef stew when it's already been cooked
Right.
interwovenly,
Right.
and I think Hawaii is one of the rare places, like New York City, where the beef stew is so delicious, and it's so hard to what's the trigger word, unpack, unravel.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't uncook something delicious anymore. It's stuck. It's either you eat it or you don't. And I guess that's what my point is. It's like, when you are in the pursuit of belonging to something that is not your island or is not your genealogy, what are you doing that is authentic, such that the next time someone cooks beef stew, you're participating in that? Are you bringing Doritos to this potluck, or are you bringing, a nice sandwich?
Hmm.
Like, bring something to the potluck that matters. And that's the starting point. Be ready to get teased, be ready to get coached, be ready to get accused of cultural appropriation, and speak your mind, say what you mean, use your words.
Hmm.
And I think that's what I notice with people who really, people not from Hawaii, not native Hawaiian, who are still, actually, some of them, leading this work in Hawaiian language revitalization, because they've learned how to just deconstruct themselves. How can you fill up a water gourd that's already filled with water, is what
Hmm.
Kumuhaunani would always say to us. So she would always ask us to come to her class as an empty gourd. Like,
Hmm.
no matter how much you know about wherever you're from or whatever, or Hawaiian language, come to class today willing to be filled with new water,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And she'd always say, "Look at the moon. The moon goes through that cycle all the time. It gets filled up and it empties it out. It's water." And that's a constant reminder to just kind of do that practice, like every situation you do, especially in Hawaiian culture.
Hmm.
Like, I'll teach you how to say this today, and then tomorrow another teacher's going to say that you're saying it wrong. Why are you saying that? And it's just like, okay, got it. New water, like,
Yeah.
got it. at the end of the day, you have more um, going on. So I don't know. That was kind of a big way of answering that question.
No, I think it was a beautiful way of answering that question. And it, you know, it I've I can't say this enough that Hawaiian culture is so rich and so full of history. And the reason why I asked that it just has me thinking about, again, the tourist lens that a lot of people have. And I think that, there are many cultures around the world that people choose to cherry pick from, and
Mm-hmm.
reduce to just, the kitschy things and the I don't know, like the fun stuff. Which is not to say that those things aren't fun, but it's just like there's more to Hawaii than just, surf
Yeah,
competitions and
like, and to really like a refreshing perspective, that is only recently coming up for me because I've, especially when Moana movie came out, like the whole
oh.
battle was they're taking the language, the name of Maui, but to
Mhm.
every single Tongan, Samoan, Marquesian, Tahitian, Rapa Nui, Hawaiian group, he is a different deity to us. He has done different things in all these different streets, okay? Like he's not the same deity. And what that movie did was just kind of like totally put all of our different stories in one movie and then like totally won in the eyes of any consumer. And
Mhm.
then Halloween costumes came up, and at the end of the day, it is what it is. And this is the refreshing perspective that I'll share with everybody. Just like how we adopt new words, and this is not everyone, I'm not speaking for the entire Hawaiian language group and efforts, but for me, what I'm observing in areas that work in the revitalization is that this breadcrumb trail we're leaving, the way we treat our language is the way we treat people.
Mhm.
And that is something I cannot take credit for. It's something that's just at the epicenter of Hawaiian being. Even when the Queen Liliuokalani, she could have gone to war and employed the Hawaiian army, the royal guards on this little illegal occupant group. But she's like, no, I will imprison myself and I will figure this out because the longevity, the life and legacy of the people is what matters to me. The garden of my kingdom, the flowers are my people, and
Mhm.
she writes songs, things that are almost going to be eternal, right? And remind future people, whether they're 100% Hawaiian or mixed like me, they're the legacy of what happened. It was like they predicted what would happen anyway. We're such a small place in the world. So as we adopt words, we adopt life, and that part of that life, whether of the ocean or of the mountain, there's going to be people, and there's different tiers of relationality. If these people want to relate to it as a Halloween costume, what we take serious in our practices,
Mhm.
then we have nothing else to teach them. We like for me as a kumu, as a founder and teacher and leader of Hawaiian language teachings, I'm not here to teach you what I know. I'm
Mhm.
here to teach you what you know. And that is like, I can't even amplify anymore of that. Is such a Hawaiian perspective that I've only learned how to kind of bring into English and communicate it,
Mhm.
especially in huge massive listening spaces like this, feeling like, am I misconstruing something, based on my personal biases? But I really think that that is something that kind of pulls at my heartstrings in a good way when I say that more and more. It's like specialize, sensitive knowledge, cultural awakenings, and belongings don't belong to everybody.
Mhm.
And the reason why these people cherry pick, capitalize, commodify, appropriate, misappropriate, whatever these words are, the reason why they do that is because they're not on that same island or genealogy. And at the end of the day, if they're making a quick buck,
Mhm.
they're going down in history on the other sides and as not favorable, and it's like, and that's why I always ask my students as I onboard them into this free online school. It's like, I tell them, ika olelo no keola, ika olelo no kamake. In life there is language, in life there is death. You could literally say something and it's going to fall out of your mouth, So watch out, because that's literally Hawaiian thinking and being.
Yeah.
And people say it's karma, but really in Hawaiian thinking, it's what you say.
All right. It's
Um,
important.
and I guess really trying to wrap up all of this that I'm bringing up is it, like, belonging is such a pursuit, but there's greater powers, especially in language, like our pronouns too, why it's
Mm-hmm.
inclusive and exclusive,
Mm-hmm.
that they they were created for certain reasons.
Right.
The power of language in Hawaiian language is like crazy. There's so many idioms and proverbs about it. And I'll end with this: I'm not worried anymore. Like, the more I learn how to facilitate my language, the more I learn about myself,
Mm-hmm.
and the more I know who I am. And the more I can do that and really authentically show up for my students, I'm seeing that you could have a native Hawaiian or non-native Hawaiian in Colorado, and they're starting to make a difference in their community in Hawaiian and non-Hawaiian stuff. It's because they're solid. Like, they can show up and just be like, okay, got it. Like, why'd and it's like, whoa, that's so Hawaiian what you did, whether you think it's Hawaiian or not, you
Yeah.
know? Um, it's like, okay, great. So these people are going to do that, but like, that's them.
Mm-hmm.
They're shaming their ancestors, and I don't even have to say that. I don't even
Yeah.
have to spend energy. I'm not going to waste another okina or kahako, you know, on these things, and just keep on keeping on.
That's really a great that's a great thing to carry with you through life, I think. Um you mentioned teaching and what you teach people. So now I would love it if you please tell us about, and I want to make sure I'm pronouncing this right. Olelo Hawaii.
Yep.
Please tell me everything about Olelo Hawaii. Um, when did you start, and how have you been able to share your language and culture with your students? What are your students like? What are some of their motivations for wanting to learn the language? And most importantly, please tell us where we can find you and how we can support you.
Yeah, I completed my graduate studies. Um, I think it was 2012, and at that point, I was already teaching at a Hawaiian immersion laboratory school for the University of Hawaii in Hilo. And that school was located in Kea'au. Ironically, that school's name was Henry Opukahaia,
Oh,
the guy that, in 1814 went to Connecticut and
yeah.
lived in New England, died translating the Bible into Hawaiian and figuring out a system to teach the English language to Hawaiian people.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Um, I was teaching there. I was teaching intermediate and high school, and I was teaching them Hawaiian through Hawaiian. Um, and at that school, we were teaching a lot of other Western disciplines like trigonometry, calculus. They were even learning Mandarin Chinese. I mean,
Wow.
and Latin. It was crazy through Hawaiian. Um, and then I was teaching at the university. I taught a few undergraduate Hawaiian language courses. And I believe, if I recall correctly, when I was in my graduate program, I taught one language course when I was in the teacher education program.
Mm-hmm.
So, I had some experience teaching for these institutions. I also helped. So the group of parents that kind of created this awesome organization, I got hired by that organization, that not-for-profit called Ahapuna Leo, and I was able to lead online classes before it was a thing, um, and help the preschool teachers that needed work and support on their instructional Hawaiian language.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it was fall 2012. I decided to take an unofficial sabbatical, right? I wasn't a tenured professor. I was just a lecturer at the bottom of the academia totem pole.
Right.
And I just thought, I fell in love with Food Network, Cooking Channel. I was doing like this plant-based diet, so I had to figure out how to cook for myself.
Mm-hmm.
It was fun. So I thought, oh, let's move to New York City and go to this popular cooking school for one
Just like
year.
that.
Just like that, I literally sold like all of my belongings. I sold my truck, my car. At that time, I let my partner know. I said, "Listen, support me or not, I'm going."
Mm-hmm.
And some of my friends were like, "Is this midlife crisis?" I'm like, "I don't know. I'm just interested, and I'll be back." So the plan was to come back to Hilo in a year. And look at this. It's like what 2012, and it's now 2021.
Yeah.
I'm still out on the East Coast. But when I moved to New York, I put out an announcement. There's this group, not for profit in New York City called Halavai, and their mission is just to connect Pacific Islanders and Hawaiians throughout the New York tri-state area.
Oh, okay.
So I said, "Hey, I'm coming up, and I would love to teach some Hawaiian language classes." Blah blah blah. So they pumped it out, and this is like to over 500 people that follows their network.
Mm-hmm.
So I started classes, and these people are hosting me where they work. So I found myself on the 30th floor at the Ford Foundation building, and then I was like down at the Metropolitan College of New York,
Mm-hmm.
and all these Soho buildings, and I'm like, wow, this is a great way to see New York and make some extra money to go out to the bar after I'm like
Exactly.
cooking all day. And then it just hit me different when I got introduced to Dan Kaufman and Ross Perlin. They both direct and co-direct the Endangered Language Alliance.
Mm.
Y'all got to check them out because they supported the launch of what I'm up to today. Um, and they're located, I think it's on 15th or 18th and 5th Avenue.
Yeah,
I don't
they're
know.
off Union Square, right?
But yeah, I had classes, and then even in Flatiron, I had a friend who owns this awesome technology company. He's Hawaiian. He's from Virginia, but
Mm.
he's like right across of Equinox, and he's like doing his clients are like eBay, NFL, and I'm like, wow, like, and I get to
Wow.
use your space for free. So I was like maxing out on in-person classes, Hawaiian language classes, and then I was like, you know what? I'm showing up late to these classes because I was teaching like 8 classes
Mm.
at one point in one day, and I'm like, oh, this is crazy.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm like, listen, we're gonna go online
Mm-hmm.
and try this out, because at that point people were still paying, and they were like, okay, you're like 15 minutes late. So long story short, we went online just for convenience for everyone, actually, come to find out. And there were some issues. People had some problems. They said, I don't know how to use this technology. I don't have this smart phone, laptop, whatever. We figured it out. And this is like 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And then I noticed that people were showing up for different reasons. You know, there were people who are of the Hawaiian diaspora, people who moved out of Hawaii, and they were living across of the mainland, the US continent. And then there were people internationally. And then after that, the second wave were these linguists and linguistic
Mm.
students. And then these like political these students in political spaces that wanted to talk about activism and reclamation of indigenous identity and well-being and rights. And I was like, whoa, this is shifting like in a very awesome way.
Yeah.
And I started getting invitations by NYU to be a keynote at like indigenous graduations. And I'm like, how did this go from side money because I wanted to just stay relevant, fresh, and keep my language up to date, into like, help, I want to reconnect with home because I
Mm.
live away from home, and be an ally with us because we're trying to figure out how to activate Lenape conversations and their waterways and rename streets along Broadway. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, what? And I'm like, I'm don't I mean, I'm
Yeah.
no language messiah. I'm
Right.
just very selfish, and I just wanted to keep my okinas and kahako in place. Like, and what came from that is really like what I have now is, and from that point on, I think I've taught at least 3,000, over 3,000 people online. They come and go. Um, I average around 15 to 20 different US states. Maybe we're across 6 different continent, I'd say regions of the major continents.
Mm-hmm.
From Japan, I know we have a whole bunch in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have a lot of people coming in from, like, specifically from Portugal. But it really is so diverse, and
Nice.
people ask like, so how do you do it? And I really believe in like a lot of what I shared earlier. It's like you come to this island, you're going to work for your food, you're going to work, and so a lot of the students, they help facilitate the space. They onboard new students, they help post announcements, they run the learner group text or chats or emails. They vet some of the requests that come in. Like there's a full application process. There's no tuition, because I really started to believe like if I'm going to really do this, I want people to be intentional. And moving to New
Yeah,
York City, people were like, you can't charge too little because people aren't going to see value in it. And I'm like, okay.
exactly. Yeah.
But then I have people back at home saying, but don't charge too much because nobody's going to pay for that. It's too
Hmm.
expensive. So here I am having two like almost capitalistic ways of thinking and influences. And I'm thinking, you know what? No one's doing something free, because that is like such a release and the freedom of creating and ownership and leadership. It's not really ownership. It's just like inspiration. It was just like unboundless. And that
Yeah.
I think really is how people show up. And going back to how people are trying to understand the culture, that's where I really was able to answer your questions, because I'm learning how to facilitate a massive diverse online space to keep it non-hostile but safe, diverse, and inclusive, and very inclusive.
Hmm.
So yeah, you can check me out at haloolelo.org. Um, and I also have a not-for-profit incorporated in New York City called Hawaiian Language Worldwide. We are relaunching it currently, so stay tuned. Right now we just have our Google site up on hawaiianlanguageworldwide.org.
Hmm.
And then another project that I resurrected from when I was in Hilo is called Mauna Hape. And Mauna Hape is a cooking community. Um, so the idea is that Halo Olelo is rigid, it's structured, there's like 6 levels of lifelong learning, and people can come and go when they want. It's very strict and, rigid. But then Mauna Hape, or Mount Happy, is very innovative. It's a playground where people can learn Hawaiian and learn how to cook. So if you want to develop your cooking skills and your language skills, you go there.
Hmm.
Um, and I think I resurrected that with the idea that looking at cultural, linguistic, digital trends, educational trends in my work, Hawaiian language revitalization, I think the next jump, I mean, COVID-19 is not a blessing. It
Hmm.
never is or was or will be a blessing. But I think an affordance that it had brought is an awareness globally about the power of online spaces,
Right.
and
Right.
even the dangers of online spaces,
Of course.
whether, and I think it kind of fast forwarded everything that I had envisioned, like, these online summits and everything. But as somebody who always wants to create newly and influence good, I really believe that it two things are going to happen. One, people, especially in this work, they're going to go from what about Hawaiian language do I know, to where do I know this about Hawaiian language.
Hmm.
And then the second thing is, now that like institutions like Hala Olalo have been set up, now you start to see a lot of influencers in social media. They're starting to create a following, almost like a school,
Hmm.
an Instagram, and
Yeah.
it's really awesome.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the next trend is going to be, it's not about if you can teach Hawaiian, it's what are you teaching in Hawaiian. Like I'm starting with food, and one of my colleagues, he saw that and he's like, dude, I'm gonna literally start an exercise channel in Hawaiian.
That's amazing.
And I'm like, okay, so fashion interior design is next, and we're gonna have Olelo Plus TV. Okay. And my friend is actually translating Netflix. He's like, No, she is with the subtitles.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like you can watch something and she's creating the technology and writing the codes. It's called Oleloflix, and my friend Kalani Bright is the
Yes.
the mind person behind that. So she is, yeah, it's such a great alliance between what's happening,
Oh my
you know,
gosh.
all for
It's
the great future of Olelo.
it's happening. That's so exciting.
Hmm.
That's immensely exciting. I'm so happy for you, and I'm really going to be following your work and following all the things that you do, because everything you've talked about in this time that we've been talking is just incredible. I'm so grateful that you were able to share so much with me and with all of us. I know I learned a lot. I hope everyone listening was taking notes the way that I was.
And by the way, just a heads up for us, but everyone that's listening. So stay tuned and follow us on HawaiianLanguageWorldwide.org because we're gearing up for a massive Hawaiian language project release on January 1st, 2022.
Okay.
Why is that date significant? So 2019 was the International Year of Indigenous Languages,
Mm.
declared by the United Nations or UNESCO. And it was so successful on a global scale that they've decided that starting January 1st to 2022, that they're going to host again, or not again, but newly, the decade of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And of course, ours truly, the Hawaiian language, is going to be one of the many participants inside this global celebration and effort to make visible all of the wonderful efforts that everyone is doing around the world.
Exciting.
I know.
That's
So stay
so
tuned.
cool. Yeah. So, what I will do is I will put all of your links and your info in the show notes so that those of you listening, if you want to get in touch, you want to learn about Alelo, you can do that really easily. Just click the links in the show notes, and you'll be in touch. And Kainoa, this conversation has lifted my spirits. Like, I wasn't sad before at all, but I'm literally on like another plane right now because I learned so much from you. And I think that this was an incredibly thoughtful and insightful conversation. And I'm so happy and grateful to you for making the time to have this chat with me today.
Yeah. Well, Hawaiian style, they always say mahalo for giving me the permission to enter your really wonderful space, your work. Um, and it really being the host, it really makes a difference. So the host is really the person to acknowledge and celebrate. And of course, everyone else in the space, everyone's warm listening. And again, for any of you who know me or know the work, hold me accountable. Please reach out. And if I fell short anywhere, Hawaiian style is always gonna, declare like if it's short, if there's errors, I'm always willing to be corrected and have a conversation. And in no means I hope it lands in any offensive way, of course. So mahalo nui.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I have my final question for you. We're going to end on a fun note here. I like to ask this question at the end of every episode. Do you have any jokes, tongue twisters, cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in Hawaiian to share?
Yeah, I think the serious side, even though I know you said on a fun note, was I just want to say that one point again before I give the fun one is Ika olelo no keola, Ika olelo no kamake. And that again means in life, in language there is life, and in language there is death. So what we speak forward will result in any one of those. Um,
Can I
yeah,
try it?
yeah, try it. So
Okay.
I'll say a piece of it, and then you can repeat
Yeah.
immediately after me because
Uh,
it's pretty long, right?
Okay.
So try this. Ika olelo no
Ika olelo no
keola.
keola.
Ika olelo no
Ika olelo no
kamake.
kamake.
Yeah, great job. A plus. A plus 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 plus. Being with all the languages you know and possibly your New York City accent is just like amazing. You're speaking Hawaiian.
I'm
Sounds
speaking
just like the real
Hawaiian.
thing. Yeah, yeah. And then the fun part, the fun one is two fun things, right? There's no gender, or there's a different kind of class in Hawaiian, A class, O class.
Mm,
So a story is that when I was giving my speech, I was talking about a favorite item. That's what we had to talk about. And it was my black JanSport backpack that I had from high school. And
mm-hmm.
so this is in front of Haunani, the professor who had passed. So I was saying ko'u eke, which means my bag. But
Mm,
there's also a variation that we just had learned, which we were supposed to be practicing, ka'u eke, right? Which is also my bag. So ko'u eke means my bag. Ka'u eke means my bag. So
oh.
the whole time I'm saying ko'u eke, everyone's giggling. Now, mind you, a little lesson here. A class, it speaks to food, things that aren't permanent, things that you can change or is by choice.
Okay.
Children, new generations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Invented things, created things, your homework. Just those are some examples. Now, O class are body parts, right? Things you cannot
I
change.
knew where this was going.
Okay, so I'll just put some advice there. When y'all gonna go and learn Hawaiian language and you hit that point where you're learning A class and O class, please pay attention and do not let your classmates giggle at you, because after class, Haunani pulled me aside and she's like, "Do you know what you just did?" And I was rolling, and she was like, "Yeah, I'm not even gonna give that a grade. I'm just gonna have you rewrite your speech appropriately and come back to class."
Oh,
You
that's
can only
funny.
imagine what was happening. So watch out for the A class and O class.
That is valuable, perfect advice. I love it.
Right. But at the heart of it, right, it's like what I really am still learning is like it's relational.
Mm-hmm.
Because like how you relate to a piece of Snickers candy bar, it might be different to how I relate to it.
Right.
Like we all relate to one object in different ways, so and same way we relate to people in different ways. And so the
Mm-hmm.
A class O class could shift in any part of your Hawaiian language learning.
Yeah,
It's crazy, but
that's so
yeah,
funny.
my bag.
Oh, that's great. That is really, really amazing. I want to say thank you again. And I know that, and you tell me if I'm, under a misconception. Aloha means goodbye and also hello.
Yeah, aloha is an experience. That's how I translate it. It's like
Okay.
even at the funeral, even when
Mm,
you hear someone passing of COVID-19, the first thing is you want to exclaim is like, my condolences. You
mm-hmm.
could also exclaim oh, aloha,
Mm,
like grief,
right, right.
it's love, grief, it's fuzzy feelings. It's
Mm,
an intentional action and it's an accidental action. It is the most complex word.
yeah.
um and I think it yeah, somehow someone got lucky to capture an experience and a feeling, a phenomenon,
Mm,
and actually put it into language. I think
yeah.
that's one word.
So I wanted to ask you because I didn't want to assume. Really quickly, I want to know after we've been talking all this time, what would be the best way in Hawaiian to say goodbye to someone?
Ooh.
Don't think about it too hard. First thing that comes to your head.
Well, the only reason why is because you said, "Oh, like I wanted us to meet again," right? So the
Okay.
first way I'm thinking, just because it's relevant to our conversation,
Mm-hmm.
is a hui ho. Try
Oh,
that.
a hui oho?
So it's a hui ho.
A hui ho.
Yeah, which means until we meet again. And even I've seen it even at funerals, like when people are like "ahui ho," but typically it's like in the hallway, or like when you leave a Christmas party or whatever. It's everywhere. "Ahui ho." It's like until we meet again, whether we meet again or not, and it's just a sweet way to short, sweet way to acknowledge a goodbye. Um,
Love it.
my favorite way though is what Haunani taught us on day one of my first official Hawaiian language like course. She wrote it on the board and she had us say it, and I was like, we didn't. And I remember not learning this pattern until like second year Hawaiian. I'm like, she had us on the first day. But it basically is this. It's mahalo keia hui ano kako. But kako, I'll just say kaua because the pronoun is just you and I instead of kako. Well, kako because all the listeners are here. So I'll say it. Mahalo keia hui ana o kako, which means this gathering of ours is in gratitude, appreciation. Um,
Oh,
and yeah, it's such a sweet way. So you want to try it?
of course.
Okay, here we go. So mahalo
Mahalo,
keia
keia,
hui ana
hui ana,
o kako.
o kako.
Yeah, and then if you want to try the whole thing, it sounds like this. Mahalo keia hui ana o kako.
Mahalo kei hui ana o kako.
Yeah, mahalo keia hui ana
Keia.
o
Mahalo
kako.
keia hui ana. Mahalo keia hui ana o kako.
Yeah, great job.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited. And I'm so grateful, and thank you a million times for this conversation. And I will be talking to you soon.
Mahalo.
Bye. Mahalo.